Hello, everyone. You are listening to the Autoinflammation Decoded and Beyond podcast, sponsored by FMF and AID Global Association. In each episode, we will focus on topics relevant to patients, physicians, and researchers interested in autoinflammatory and innate immune diseases. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, and welcome to the Autoinflammatory Decoded and Beyond podcast. Today's guest is Rachel Rimmer, who is the founder of the Rare Autoinflammatory Conditions Community, UK, and she is working on behalf of autoinflammatory patients across the United Kingdom and Wales, and is joining us today to discuss the autoinflammatory situation in the UK, as I said, and she is not only a patient, but she is a patient advocate and has a disease referred to as MKD, which we'll be getting into further as we have our discussion. Rachel, welcome to our podcast.
Hello, thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Thank you for joining us.
You're very welcome. How are you doing today?
I'm doing quite well. How about yourself?
I'm okay. I'm warm, but we're okay.
Hanging in there.
Yeah.
So tell us really quickly, Rachel, to begin our podcast, how you came to be diagnosed and what is your disease all about?
So I was diagnosed actually at 16 years old with mevalonate kinase deficiency. I was quite a delayed diagnosis, I think. I was born with my symptoms, so my mum uses the phrase, she knew I was trouble when I came out into the world. And I think that's quite appropriate because a lot of doctors and professionals were quite stumped as to not really knowing what my condition was. And I had a skin biopsy taken when I was 15 on suspected autoinflammatory pathway, but they weren't quite sure which type. A London hospital for children, they suspected HIDS, which is the one end of the spectrum of MKD. So yes, they took a skin biopsy and sent it over to the Netherlands for genetic testing, and indeed they were correct that I have variants for MVK gene.
And that disease used to be called HIDS, which I guess over time has now emerged into the MVK. And I believe MVK is, how many people do you think about worldwide are affected? I'm told that it's quite a rare disease in the spectrum of autoinflammatory.
Yeah, it's not a well-known one for sure. Not that any of the autoinflammatory ones are well-known, I guess. It is classified as a rare disease. I think there must be probably 350 documented diagnosed. When I look at the registry, but that's only in the EU, as far as I'm aware. But worldwide, I would probably say 500 at a guess.
Wow. So fairly rare autoinflammatory disease. Most people know that in the autoinflammatory world, familial Mediterranean fever is probably one of the most well-known diseases, but that there are several other monogenic and polygenic disorders, with HIDS being one of the several monogenic inherited diseases that you express with either at birth, childhood, and even sometime into adulthood. So your situation is definitely unusual, and it's like many children, I would imagine some places it takes longer to get a diagnosis than other places, depending on the availability of genetic testing and sequencing and specialized types of care. And so with your MVK disease over time, I guess going into adulthood, you created a group, which is like I introduced you with the RAC UK. Can you tell us a little bit about what what made you decide to create this group, and maybe how it is working on behalf of yourself and other patients across the UK.
Definitely. So I think I hit a period of my life where I was feeling so frustrated, not knowing anyone else with my condition. My parents never had support with other parents. We never knew anybody else with this condition or even a different autoinflammatory condition until I was probably in my mid-20s. So,
Oh, wow.
unfortunately, I came out of work employment because my health was just too bad to maintain a job. And rather than sitting at home twiddling my thumbs, feeling sorry for myself, I thought, do you know what? I'm going to do something about this. And I set up a support group, so to speak, on social media, and it grew. We started reaching out to other types of patients with different autoinflammatory conditions, and that it was quite clearly a need within the UK for an organisation for patients because they weren't necessarily having there wasn't anywhere that they could meet each other, and that feeling of
Sure.
isolation it's really lonely. And it's not just about the patients having each other to talk to and support each other through difficult times. It's about the parents being able to share their experiences and sound off to each other when it's difficult as well. And I think, okay, so I didn't have that growing up, but why should the other children not have that? And my actual career wise was going to be within early childhood studies. So I thought, well,
Oh,
I
wow.
could I could bring the two together in some way and help families in a different way of life, using my own experiences.
When you started this process in meeting up with other patients across the UK, how do you think your impact is measured for helping other children? Did you find that you were able to really impact other cases where the young person was at a stage where the parents might not know what to do? Were you able to help intervene and help get better diagnostic um, time frames than what you had to manage?
I think it was a difficult one because we had a lot of people at different stages of their journeys. Some had already been diagnosed, but they weren't doing so well on their treatment that they were having. Some weren't diagnosed at all and didn't have clinicians with any kind of the right knowledge involved in their care. So at that point, we moved forward with the charity registration to allow us to be able to collaborate with medical professionals and develop those relationships so that we could advocate for those patients, and not necessarily medical professionals with autoinflammatory specialist knowledge, but to help educate them about, these conditions exist. This is how they're tested, and this is how they are treated. This patient needs to be able to access this particular service. So we now provide one-to-one consultations for all ages. If they're under 16, then it's with the parents. But once they become sort of in their teen years, then we allow the person to speak to us first, as long as the parents are around and we've all got joint consent. Because it's really important for a young person to have a voice. It's about them and how it makes them feel. And if they don't have that opportunity to share their experiences in that way, it can cause a lot of harm in their later adulthood, as it did with me. We have a lot of trauma, medical trauma. So getting it right from very early on with the parents having these young children, yes, we spend a lot of time educating the families and then educating the medical professionals and liaising with them to get a referral to a specialist. Obviously, we're restricted as a patient organisation. We don't have the ability to be able to refer directly, unfortunately. I wish we could. It would make things a lot easier. But
Of course.
and also, there's a holistic approach to a world with autoinflammatory. So not only do individuals struggle with the health aspect of it, but for children, you've got difficulties in school. The autoinflammatory medical issues affect their schooling, their education. So we're now liaising with schools. This child has this condition. These are the symptoms to look out for. Here's a handbook that we have created. You can monitor their symptoms within school. It can act as a communication booklet between school and the parent. And then when parents take their children to hospital appointments, that information is there in front of them to discuss. School are now seeing this. This isn't just me making it up. This is what is actually going on. So it's just one booklet and they can keep everything together.
That sounds like a really interesting concept that I think is often missed in rare disease children across the board of the diseases, is the impact of education and the problems that brings for a school-age child to be able to keep up, manage their coursework, learn to read, learn to do mathematics. That is a whole struggle for not only the child, but I would imagine their family, much less if you only have a few experts across, different countries to work on these diseases. It would probably, in my opinion, be so important to also train the general practitioners down to the school nurse and the teachers, like a whole litany, a whole community of people who can help not only manage and assist with the education part, but then also to record and document the symptoms, making sure that the child, if they're on a medication, if they're lucky to find a treatment, whether that treatment is really effective, and what is, if it is not completely effective, how that really impacts the child in their social and school settings, because those are two really important critical parts of growing up. Especially, making sure that you can acquire skills going forward to become a functioning adult. So with that work that you've done, and that sounds really fabulous, to create like a binder or a place where all this information that goes around to each of the child's circles of, if you will, how that then impacts then your work with other organizations, including FMF and AID Global, and how can we work on, I guess, replicating what goes on in different countries, the best practices, so to speak, to make those available to other, top down, bottom up, to make those available to other families and children and adult patients in other parts of the world. Tell us a little bit about how you kind of came to be working with FMF and AID Global as well.
So I can't even remember what year it was now, maybe 2018, since we started working with FMF and AID Global Association. We felt that, yes, there was a need for better support in the UK, and we needed a charitable organisation as such to be able to do this work. But where do we even start? Where do we begin with this work? There are so many issues, and I'm sat there thinking, surely other countries must be facing these challenges as well. So as soon as I sort of reached out to FMF and AID Global Association, there was a solid agreement that these issues were happening in other countries too. And I thought, right, okay, this is a great opportunity for us to then work together and discuss these challenges that we face together and try and find some strategies to be able to overcome these challenges on our own national levels. So with FMF and AIDS Global Association, they have affiliates, as you well know, that are from other countries, other organisations such as ourselves. And by being able to link everybody together, it means that we as advocate leaders have that opportunity to share best practice and make suggestions within our own countries. What works well, what doesn't work well, what can we do to change that? What can we keep that is working well? So I think it's a great, it's such a lonely road being a patient, but it can be quite a lonely road running these organizations, because we rely on collaboration so much. Otherwise, how's anything going to improve for patients?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you all have decided to join with the FMF and AID, because it is so critical to not only learn how to manifest the organization more effectively at the as I would call it, the country or the local level, but also to understand, with rare diseases, especially with autoinflammatory ones, they're very rare, and they're not always, as we've talked about a little bit, well known. And the greater the community globally, I think, will hopefully in the future affect better outcomes. We have a long way to go in regards of medications, treatment, of course, just regular average doctors being able to identify and say, I think this child or young adult might need a specialist. So that type of collaboration is really critical for organizations. It's really hard to have organizations just run a whole show on their own without reaching out to the global community. And one of the things that I've learned in this process is how, despite the uniqueness of the diseases, every country has very different ways of managing their social care, managing their doctor training, managing their whole insurance or paying for patients. So it's very important that none of us, forget that each country is really unique in its way of managing all of this. And there needs to be like the pull out of the good and the bad and the ugly, because each country has its own, differential, problems that definitely need better solving for the patients. Can you talk a little bit about what MKD is? We know it's originally, identified as Iberian fever or HIDS years and years ago. Talk to us about what that disease looks like, and how would a parent maybe know that their child at birth, or even as a young, toddler, what are the signs, and what should people be on the lookout for this type of autoinflammatory disease?
So within the last couple of years, the landscape of MKD has changed. We did have the separation of the HIDS, hyper IgD syndrome, and then the mevalonic aciduria. So HIDS being the mild end of the spectrum, and mevalonic aciduria being at the severe end of the spectrum. And they were considered to be two separate entities, but now they are very much mild and severe, and the disease is just called mevalonate kinase deficiency over here in the UK. I think the landscape is changing elsewhere across the globe as well. The more that is understood, when I was first diagnosed, I was given the diagnosis of hyper IgD syndrome, but now at 37 years old, it's quite clear that I have severe end of the spectrum mevalonate kinase deficiency. So when I was first born and before any diagnosis, I think like other children with MKD, I was getting recurrent fevers, and it was suspected that I had sepsis, pneumonia, but all these tests kept coming back. The cultures were clear and they couldn't understand where this temperature was coming from. I think sometimes even if children are having lower temperatures, they're still high, but maybe around the 38 or maybe 37.78, they're just considered as having a virus, and it'll go away, it'll be fine within a couple of days. But that's not necessarily the case. A child does not get these fevers on a regular basis every month. And it mirrors what we see in other autoinflammatory conditions. So not only are there recurrent fevers, but we get the skin rashes. And in MKD, I have seen some quite different variations actually with skin rashes. For me, I got quite bad blotching, and it was more like urticaria. But I have seen some children with pictures where they've had maybe spots and that look like they've got little heads on, but they haven't. It's just inflammation. Gastrointestinal issues. Some children, even adults, we have severe gastrointestinal issues. We get diarrhea, and I think that's probably one of the key signs to begin with in childhood is diarrhea, along with the fevers and the skin rashes, mouth ulcers, and they can be really painful. And you will find that you have to adjust your diet if you have the diarrhea or the mouth ulcers because it's painful. What else is there?
May I ask, how long do these flares in these diseases typically last? I know in some of the other autoinflammatory diseases, the general criteria is some patients will have like a 3 to 5 day period. Other patients will have like a 2 or 3 week period. Is HIDS very finite in its flaring, or is it something where some patients may have a longer flare versus another patient, or some kids will run a fever for 4 days versus maybe 10 days? Talk a little bit. Is there a lot of differential there, or
I
is it?
I do think there is a differential. I do, because what's documented in research, if we look back now, it says 3 to 7 days. But actually, we know, and I know personally, that my flares can go on for about 2 weeks at a time. And
Wow.
each flare is different. Some days it might just be that there's a couple of days of fever, like 3 days of a recurrent fever, and then that subsides. And then some flares, there's this horrible gastro issue where everything just tenses up and you can't go to the toilet and you're being sick and you're in a huge amount of pain, which I think also overlaps with one of the symptoms of FMF, from what I know of. So it's interesting what is documented in research compared to what I've been seeing in patients actually. And it's not, I wouldn't just say patients within the UK. I mean, MKD patients elsewhere in other countries as well.
Globally. Yeah.
Yeah, so there seems to be a huge disparity.
I think that's really an issue in rare diseases in general, is that it is so rare, so they have finite research, and then you have slots for the people that they want to examine and follow. And so though they build a consensus on the symptoms and what is the criteria for the disease within that, but if it's only based on, let's say, 100 patients or maybe 50 patients, or even in some cases even smaller because of the rarity, then you lose the idea that the criteria don't always equal out the patient. And I would imagine that that's a huge hurdle when you're sitting in front of a physician, expert or not, saying, these are my symptoms. And they're sitting there with a book going, well, this matches sort of. And it does not allow for sort of the out of the box, well, perhaps, you are either an outlier or perhaps we've been incorrect about how we go about making the criteria so solid without having some more give and take, that patients may actually look different at different times. I think it's really interesting. One thing you said about the HIDs is that, sometimes you'll have horrible GI manifestations in a flare, and then other times it may just be like an unrelenting fever or even a low grade fever that lasts a good while, which can also really drain your energy and make you feel terrible. I mean, that's another whole part of the criteria for autoinflammatory diseases, is that you're always supposed to come with a flare that has A, B, C, and D. And what happens when your flare for this month is only B and C, and then your next flare next month or 2 months later is only D. I think this is a big problem across all rare diseases, is trying to capture what is the reality of the patient. I mean, it's not like a heart disease where you can measure hundreds of thousands of people and you can pull criteria from all kinds of studies because there's so many people affected by that. This is it, it's really it's not so great to box everybody together. I mean, that can definitely be, I would imagine, a real problem. But do you feel like most children now in the UK alone are having better diagnostic help because of the work you've done and some of this awareness, at least at birth, if they see a child or a young, really young, toddler who keeps having, this reoccurring fevers or GI, like, do you think there's a little bit better awareness among the UK doctors about it, or is it still variable and not well known?
I think some of it is a postcode lottery. If you live in a more affluent area where they've got more resources and specialist centres, Wales has had such an issue in recruiting doctors within rheumatology. So patients within Wales who may be presenting with these symptoms haven't been able to access rheumatologists within where they live. So therefore, that's delayed diagnosis. And we are still seeing adults coming through getting diagnosis, even though they may have been symptomatic through childhood. I know within London, we've got 2 centres. If you live in London, you're more likely to be taken straight to those centres early on. We've got people living within Scotland where they're presenting, but the knowledge might not be there enough. And we as an organisation are having to reach out and say, hey, look, we've got these resources. Can you help us? Is there somewhere on your website, or is there a physical place in which we can then put resources in, so that if a patient or if a parent comes into a clinic concerned about their child and sees it and reads it and they think, oh, that could be what my child has. And then they start to see maybe a different way of getting a diagnosis. Or, I mean, for adults, it's a bit more difficult, I guess, because they've gone all their childhood with being ill, but nobody's picked it up. Excuse me, 1 minute. All right.
No, I mean, I think that's really interesting what you said about even within like England or the UK. One area might have a few more rheumatologists and have a center of excellence, which might get you a little bit more access. Whereas you have basically a medical desert in Scotland where nobody knows about these diseases, whether you're a young child or an adult. But I also think it's really interesting what you said about the number of rheumatologists, because they've done some surveys just alone in the United States, where rheumatology really per capita across the United States is scary. Like the ratio of community to one doctor is just absolutely enormous. And there's no way that one rheumatologist, whether it's adult or pediatric, can manage the rare, much less more common, inflammatory like lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, all the other diseases that a rheumatologist is responsible for, managing and treating. So that in itself is very interesting to know that that is probably going on in many other countries. And then what do governments do to help recruit more of these medical students, or maybe incentivize them to go into rheumatic disease categories or even immunology? Because I don't know if it's similar there, but we do see sometimes autoinflammatory patients will be actually diagnosed by an immunologist here in America. Perhaps that's an area that the UK hasn't really focused on, or maybe there's just not a lot of immunologists either. I mean, we have the same problem with that as well. Rheumatology is needing more doctors, and so is immunology, and it may be the same elsewhere. I cannot speak for the other countries, but that's really interesting. Location can be everything, and if you're in a desert, so to speak, medically, how can, like you said, materials, brochures, posters, you go to the doctor, and while you're waiting your 20 minutes there, or however long it is for you, you see all the things on the wall with the parts of the body. Maybe those are ways to get messaging out there to parents or to families who are just sitting there randomly wondering, like, why is my child suffering for their eighth fever in 5 months? And what is this? So that is quite interesting.
I think we see quite a lot of parents who have clearly done a lot of reading themselves when their children are presenting with these sort of symptoms, because yes, okay, so every child will get, the coughs and the sniffles when they're in nursery.
Sure.
That's normal. But what we see within autoinflammatory conditions, that is definitely not normal. And I think after so long, parents are thinking, this has got to be something else. This is not normal, particularly if it's not their first child as well. If it's their second child and they're thinking, well, my first wasn't like this, why is my second child like this? I think it's even harder when it is your first child, because there's a lot of speculation around maybe the mother's mental health, and is she a paranoid parent? All those things come up to question, and we have to deal with that very subtly, and no, you're not crazy.
No, I think that's really another interesting idea too, the first child versus the second or third child. And, unfortunately with genetic disease, they can show up at any time. And some first children are lucky to have it skip over, and some not. And that's interesting because first time parents are already like anxiety ridden just about being first time parents. And then to have this whole other level of what is typical and normal to a young child's health. Obviously children are going to get sick. They're going to have, respiratory or, a couple infections, chicken pox or what have you, or other things over time that just happen. But yeah, how do you really as a parent get in there and identify, like, there is something wrong here? And often, mother's intuition is regarded as, they must be a little crazy and overprotective of their child, when in reality, I think humans often sense things that are not quite right, first time parent or not. And it's always a shame when we do see cases where the first time parent has gotten a lot of pushback from the doctors, and it ends up being something serious, and mom tends to feel vindicated and hopefully gets the best treatment and help for the child is needed. So that's really an interesting, I hadn't really thought about first versus second child, but yeah, that can really be quite, I would imagine, quite interesting as a second time parent going into the doctor's office and really saying, no, there is something completely wrong, because compared to brother or older sister, this is just not not right. Um, Tell me also, I mean, I know that you all have reached out and worked with some research institutes and folks around the world. Tell me about, are they making any progress? Are you working with anybody that you think is going to make some headway into, MKD or other autoinflammatory diseases? What is your sort of feel for that? And what have you all accomplished or done or started doing?
So that with it just within the UK itself, we have linked up with two teams. One in the east of the UK. They are looking at single cell technology in developing. I think they're trying to find a genetic link in one of the lesser. It's definitely not a monogenic at the moment. It's CRMO. So
Mhm.
as a patient organisation, and that CRMO falls under our remit as well, they reached out to us and said, look, we really need to be able to research more into this condition. There are no treatments available. We just need to get this done. Would you support this? So we spoke to a few patients that we know that we've supported, and they said, absolutely, we love this. Yes, please go for it. So we have helped support a funding application, a research application within the East, and then in sort of mid-north area, we've got a team working on single cell technology, trying to find alternative testing for patients that may not have a pathogenic variant, but still requires treatment. And because of the way that treatments are available or not available at the moment within the UK, it's very hit and miss. So if you've got a pathogenic variant, you get a diagnosis and then you get treatment. That's the pathway for pathogenic variants. If you come back and those pathogenic variants haven't been found, or there's a likely pathogenic variant, but they're not quite sure still, it's even harder to get the treatments that are needed. So when this research team reached out to us and said, look, this is what we want to do, this is what we hope to achieve, do you support this as a patient organisation? Like, yes, please. We are so desperate for this. But why do we have to do all this research to be able to give them what they actually need? But they need the data to prove it. And it's all part of the rules and regulations of administering, prescribing. We understand it, but as a patient, it's so frustrating. Really frustrating.
I would imagine, yeah. I think that is also a big problem for all autoinflammatory patients who come back hoping that their genetic, panels, whether they're a long panel, a big panel, even a smaller one, even a West screen, whole exome sequencing, you're always hoping that there is going to be a, gift in that data that is going to show a result. And, unfortunately, I believe it's around 50 to 60% of patients with autoinflammatory symptoms actually have no genetic identification available because the diseases in some way, they've been studying them for years and, decades, but it's so new and the genetic revolution is only just arrived. And in many parts of the world, they still don't even have full genetic testing available and easily accessible, easily affordable. And it's really, really a conundrum for rare disease patients who are going to have to go and beg and borrow to get that kind of testing. And then when you come back with negative, then what? I mean, here in the United States, they usually, if you look like you have the symptoms, they'll put a USAD diagnosis or unspecified or, undifferentiated autoinflammatory diagnosis to try and make the coding easier to get on actual treatment. So tell me, what do they do? So they basically leave these people, whether they're young or old, to fend for themselves, or are they coming up
So
with some new ways to deal with that?
they are trying. There is one team that is trying to find a different test to prove that children require these treatments that are available already. And it will be looking at sort of like the cytokine pathways. And, you know, if it's cytokine 1 pathway that needs to be targeted, then that opens options for one lot of drugs. If it's cytokine pathway known as interleukin 6, then that opens up a pathway for other types of drugs. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens with the landscape of that over the next couple of years. I'm not expecting major changes very quickly. It's going to take some time. We have a couple of cases that we have sort of pushed and said, you know, I think these are the first ones that you need to study more, just because they've not had pathogenic variants come up in the testing. So there's hope. And then separately to that sort of work, we have been we've been collaborating with a young researcher who's actually based in the US. We came across him on social media, actually, and he's looking at mevalonate kinase deficiency and the involvement of sort of the liver. So just a background of that, for the last couple of years, I've been really concerned about my liver because I've had extremely high liver enzyme results, and there doesn't seem to be much concern going on at the national centre that I attend, but locally hepatology were brought in at one point, and they did a load of tests and a biopsy, and they thought that I'd been drinking too much alcohol. So long story short, you know, I came across this research and I thought, wow, this is amazing. And he wanted to ask me about the patient experience, and I was more than happy to, you know, I jumped onto Zoom, I gave him a sort of an introduction as to what's going on with me, and then he spoke about, you know, what he thinks is happening. And even though I'm not quite familiar with the exact science of it, there is definitely a connection with the liver and the bile ducts and the encephalinoids. And it's great because the one thing that I said to him was, one, he's given an opportunity for a patient to have a voice before he's really got stuck into anything. He wrote a thesis recently and he asked me if I would like to write the foreword for it. And I was really honoured.
Fantastic.
That allowed a patient to have a voice, you know, and I'm very conscious that when these opportunities come up, that it's not always about me, but because it was my condition, I grabbed it and I ran with it and I did it, and I was like, yes, finally, we're getting somewhere. So that was one opportunity that he gave me, and then we've been chatting, and, you know, a few things personally have come up, and I've been able to ask him questions that maybe I haven't been able to ask anybody else before. And he's not always had the answers, but he said, well, okay, leave it with me and I will see what I can find out for you. And it's also about knowing how things are done elsewhere. Again, international collaboration is the only way we're going to be able to drive forward on a global perspective. So after some time talking to him, I said to him, do you know what? Your interests are very similar to a researcher that's now based in Australia who came from the UK. And he originally worked on my diagnosis. So he took my blood. I called him the vampire when I was younger because he took a lot of blood from me. And the skin sample, I think he studied that as well as the Netherlands. So they were all arguing over who wanted what. So yes, luckily I've been able to link the young researcher in America to the researcher in Australia, and they have now signed an international collaboration agreement so that they could discuss their research with each other and their findings. And it's incredible because, you know, that's been driven from a collaboration of itself. You know, we're just so determined to be able to get answers. And it does seem like there may be a different approach we can target as treatment for mevalonate kinase deficiency in the future, but it needs more research for now. So yes, we're seeing metabolic aspects of the condition. That's been documented already, but it's not understood enough yet. So at the moment,
that is absolutely a fantastic way to raise the patient's voice, by being lucky enough to meet with some researchers and open-minded people who want to look beyond, like we talked about, just the basic criteria that's in the current medical literature. It's just not enough. And I believe strongly, as I'm sure you do, that these diseases are quite complex, more so than is on paper. And what goes on in the body at so many different levels, not just genetically, but enzymatically, metabolically, hormonally, has massive impact for the patient. And it's so unknown. There's such a vast realm of information that we don't know. And I think it's quite interesting what you said about the biomarkers, or looking at the cytokine pathways and trying to figure out what else can be developed beyond genetic testing, which, as we mentioned, is just out of reach for some people. Or if you're in a dry medical desert area where there is no doctor who knows, how can we get testing to be made available, or to be developed and then made available, to actually look at different ways of looking at inflammation in the body. I mean, the standards are, for autoinflammation, basically looking at your CRP, your C-reactive protein, and your serum amyloid, your SAA, which of course you might know is not even available in the United States. There is no SAA testing unless you're a horse or an animal. And how do we look beyond that? Because it's a myth that, CRP is going to tell you can have a hugely inflamed patient and your CRP is normal. Oh, well, the patient is fine. And that's just, that's not how any of this works. And I think that's fantastic. So hopefully they will make some headway looking at these molecules or inflammatory pathways, leading to, a molecular change that can hopefully affect, not only patients in Great Britain, but all over the world, that these tests can be, widely, manufactured to help everybody. Tell me, I know we're coming to sort of an ending here soon, but maybe you could just give us a little bit of insight into how the United Kingdom government is managing these patients. I know that, there have been some issues in the UK getting diagnosed. We talked a little bit about that. And I know for other patients, it can be a real challenge. How do you think the UK system is working, from the level of looking at a patient who's young and in either baby, toddlerhood, young adults, and then the transition between those ages, and what kind of support is available if they're correctly diagnosed, to adulthood, and how is that working? As we know, these diseases can be very impactful, against living a productive full life. And the treatments, as we've talked, are not always successful, and are often not even efficacious to the point where the patient is fully functional. I mean, anybody will take any function improvement with these diseases, but how do you think that's working uniquely in the UK, and what does that transition look like?
it's a difficult one. The UK is facing sadly, a very challenging time. We've got an amazing, healthcare service. And when it works, it's, we are so grateful compared to other countries. Unfortunately, it's not being invested in my view, for a number of years now, and resources and staff retention has been depleted. And that's sad, because that means ultimately that even in general medicine, for routine appointments and procedures, there's a huge waiting time at the moment, just in general medicine. I mean, I think even in respiratory medicine, you're looking at 18 months at the moment to get seen.
Wow.
Referral, because of the knock-on effects that maybe COVID has had. And now, you know, that there's been a backlog of patients in that time that needed to be seen but couldn't because they were prioritizing severely ill patients, which we understand. But it doesn't help the patient when you are presenting with these symptoms, you know. So for us with the rarer conditions, I think it's even more frightening for us at the moment, because if we can't get the routine medicine and the infrastructure behind the routine medicine right within the next 2 years, then we really do have a work cut out, to be honest. I mean, yes, we end up doing a lot of work, and some work I strongly believe that NHS resources should be funded better. We should not be receiving parents in a crisis because, you know, their mental health suffering, trying to get, you know, manage their child's condition, or their child's suffering because they've had a bad day at school and nobody understands. We seem to be picking up quite a lot of gaps at the moment. And whilst we're happy to do that, you know, we're not funded, and we're also not qualified as such as these practitioners are. So whilst I do have my own qualifications in early childhood studies, and with that came a lot of support, you know, I'm not a medical professional. I haven't done my counselling skills. I heavily rely on volunteers to help support families. And that means sometimes just being in the background to manage the business side of things, whilst I can help support on a one-to-one basis with a family in crisis. But if I was to be asked what the government needs to do to help rare diseases, it absolutely needs to address the waiting times. It needs to invest in the NHS, workforce retention, and just basic medicine, full stop. Because otherwise, these patients with rare conditions are not going to be able to live the lives that we should be able to. We should be allowed to. And at the moment, we don't feel like we're a priority. We're right down at the bottom of the list because we're the most expensive ones. So until the basic infrastructure has been fixed, yeah, we've got another 10, 15 years of this, I think.
Wow, that sounds like it's really not very well managed for the general population. I can only imagine they really probably don't have a very good focus on transitioning rare disease patients who are in childhood, moving them into young adulthood or the workforce, so to speak. Do you believe that the UK, in addition to the medical part of all of this, do you believe that they have the same typical problems in social services or social supports for medically challenged folks, no matter what their age? Is it sort of a
Yes.
similar type of problem?
So I see a huge issue in social care. Social care do not seem to have a huge amount of reach in terms of medically ill young people or adults. It seems to be you either have to be sort of on palliative basis to get social care as a child, or you have to have really extremely complex needs where you need equipment adjusting as you grow, and social care and occupational therapy then work together, and they go into school and make sure that resources are into school as well. But those that don't necessarily need a lot of equipment but have more of the medical aspects going on, there's a huge gap. I mean, a parent has to fight tooth and nail to get extra financial support from the government to be able to live, because, you know, we've got the dynamics of going to hospital appointments. Some people have to travel from Scotland to London to be seen. That's a huge expense of a patient or a family. They're having to take time off work, so it's a loss of wages. If a child is ill, you know, the parents have to take time out of work. If an adult patient is ill, 9 times out of 10, they're probably not well enough to be able to work at all. But the ones that are, they still end up having to take a lot of time off, and sick pay, statutory sick pay in adults is not great. It's not livable. We're in a living cost crisis as it is. So with that on top, yeah, I think social care, economics, healthcare at the moment, everything seems to be a real struggle. And that's just for someone functioning without high level needs. So yeah, it's difficult.
I mean, your comments bring two thoughts to sort of my idea that, one, if you're not a disabled person with an actual picture of disability, i.e. wheelchair, prosthetic limb, neck brace, you know, something that physically demonstrates that you are with a disability, that is a huge challenge, because when we talk about the invisible disability of autoinflammatory and other rare diseases, and it also sounds like from what you've said that without this sort of social support, the crisis of trying to get your child a diagnosis, one thing is to really focus in on is how much educational learning gets lost for that young child, whether they're even in toddlerhood. I mean, especially in grade school. I mean, the loss of learning to that child probably can be a real detriment down the road later in life, because they need to be able to read, do math, you know, whatever their specialty, develop skills so that they can join the workforce at some point. So I would imagine that the government would be, and in any government, would be really wise to ramp up social supports. And, you know, obviously the medical is without a doubt in need of change all over the place, to really help that child find their way, much less how many older adults who come into this with a diagnosis late in life have missed out on a lot of their schooling or education and can't really do what they would like to be or capable of doing with their brains, because they too missed out on so much of that educational support coming into adulthood. And that is truly a shame. And it's sort of, you know, it compounds not just being a rare disease patient, but then it compounds what your educational and work capabilities are. So that is quite a handful, I would imagine, for the government of United Kingdom and the different countries to really start focusing in and paying attention and trying to figure out a way out. You know, despite politics and despite whoever's in charge, I mean, the people clearly need help, and much less to the rare disease community at large there and elsewhere. So I think that is quite not surprising, but stunning nonetheless for all the patients. And I would imagine you would get sympathy from patients all over the world who face similar but different, based on where they are, different problems.
Definitely.
So,
I think if I was to be asked what immediate change could happen now, would be a health and educational and social care plan per individual attached to their medical records. And each party has their own role of providing support. And then it's all joined up, and everybody knows how much support that individual requires. And then a budget can be allocated to an individual. At the moment, and it's not just within the UK that I see it, but there seems to be a blanket of you either need support or you don't. And there's no in between. You know, you've either got really significant high level needs or you don't need anything at all. But, you know, we've got people that are here, 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 and here. And
different needs.
yeah.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. It almost mirrors your binder idea, where you've got your binder that you work with these cases on. It goes to everybody, everybody's aware, and there's a formula or a semi-formula for what this particular patient needs. And I think that's a really interesting idea that, you know, if patients around the globe had that kind of a package or a breakdown of their needs from these different areas, medical, social, family, you know, even transportation, things that, you know, normal people might not think about. You know, I think that would be really good to sort of start thinking about as a way out for rare disease patients to kind of get the help and support they really need, which is, you know, sadly, as we discussed, sort of lacking across the board. And I do think that, you know, hopefully in the future we can use some of these newer technologies and, you know, newer ways of figuring out disease to sort of integrate with each other. And I think as the patient community, we will have a chance to hopefully have our voices heard on that, because, you know, no patient should be left behind, whether they're 2 years old or, you know, 72. You know, everybody deserves to have, you know, a decent shot to do something, to access treatment, to access care. And it really shouldn't be about your age or whether or not you have a physical disability that can be seen, or if you're like most autoinflammatory patients, you know, the invisible sort. So I think this was a really interesting discussion. If you have any final words, you know, feel free to speak up on that. I think this has been an interesting talk. And, you know, we'll look forward to the NHS hopefully moving itself further up the ladder rather than going backwards for their rare disease community. And, you know, I think with the HIDS research that you've started, you know, working with to get a collaboration going, I think it's fantastic. And, you know, hopefully that there'll be some really good outcomes from that will be able to be documented and, you know, shared with all kinds of patients, autoinflammatory HIDS cases around the globe. And, you know, we're clearly going to see more of this. I think rare disease is always a misnomer because it's only rare to the doctors who haven't seen, you know, multiple cases. And then all of a sudden, a disease that was supposedly 1 in 1 million, oh, there's cases showing up, you know, in all parts of the world. And if, you know, that means there's more than just one. So really interesting work. But thank you so much. If you have do you have any comments, anything else to add to this conversation today?
I think I'd like to just end with a huge thank you to the families that, you know, put trust in us to be able to help them. It's been a real honor so far to see a lot of successful journeys and a lot of the children particularly who are having a better start in life to us oldies. And I hope that, you know, those things continue to improve for other families, and we're not alone. There is help out there. And yes, let's stick together and carry on with this global collaboration because it's the only way forward.
I agree. And Rachel, thank you so much for joining us. And I look forward to your continued great work and reading and talking with you about how United Kingdom patients can be helped by your organization. Thank you so much. And it was a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to the Autoinflammation Decoded and Beyond podcast. I hope you found today's episode informative and engaging. If you enjoyed the discussion, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with others who might benefit. For more information, visit our website at fmfbandaid.org. Stay connected, stay informed, and we will see you in the next episode.